So process costing, last time we talked about job costing. And so when we're talking about process costing and job costing, what are the big differences? The big differences here are that process costing is to identify uniform cost goods. So we talked about like the good examples are like consulting work versus producing water bottles. Like every water bottle should be the same. It should have the same amount of plastic, same amount of water in it, all the same costs, right? That's process costing. What we went over was job costing, which is very customized. Each have their challenges, right? Because process costing, we have so much volume of units. We have this thing, huge volume. How do we allocate cost to each unit? While job costing, we have the customization issue, is how do we allocate the customized cost? Normally job costing is a little easier because we can allocate based off of a specific, when there's custom jobs, we have specific identifiers for those custom jobs, like job cost sheets that we were talking about before. What do I want you to learn here is what's the difference between process and job costing? Figuring out this concept. This is going to be a tough concept, okay? It requires a good amount of arithmetic and arithmetic mental gymnastics, I'd call it, where we have to compute equivalent units and explain their order and process costing. And then we're going to discuss the different types of weighted averages like LIFO, FIFO, and weighted average costing. Very similar to what we did in financial accounting, where we had to do LIFO, FIFO. It should all be similar. We're going to talk about hybrid costing systems, and then we'll walk through procedurally how the flow works. I'll try to stop during some examples so we have some kind of reference in Google Sheets. So what's the difference between process and job costing? I think that's relatively simple. We're saying process costing is like water bottles or soda cans or hamburgers, right? We make a ton of them. And the history behind this is fascinating. I can go into it sometime. But like the fact that we are able to create a bunch of uniform goods is a huge marvel of the modern mankind, and one of the reasons we can have such a high quality of life now. But part of that, like one of the reasons accounting is so fundamentally important, is we weren't able to produce on a mass scale until we understood how to reduce costs, right? So one of the reasons that we care about process operations is because we want to make each unit as cheap as possible. And that adds a ton of value to each of our lives. Like this, I know it's an abstract concept, but if we can mass produce an item and lower the cost, then everyone gets the item for cheaper, which means more people get items, which means that like less people starve, right? Like it's a big value add, understanding that we can lower the cost of items. And so that the mass production and figuring out how we can allocate cost to uniform items is extremely important if we want to be profitable, and understand how we can continue to lower costs. This is always a series of repetitive processes. And like always, we're going to do what we always do in managerial accounting. We allocate direct materials, labor, and factory overhead to move towards completion. So the whole goal is to have finished goods. So what we covered in chapter 1 is really the fundamentals, like direct materials, direct labors, and factory overhead make finished goods. That doesn't change here in process operations. It is how are we allocating it? Because of the volume of goods, we can't have a job sheet for every single water bottle, right? That would make no sense. So we have to make some allocation methodologies up. So let's compare them. So in the job system, we have direct materials, direct labor, overhead. That's every system, right? We always have those systems when we're making products. We have our job cost sheet where we write down how these are allocated, and our work in process, our finished good, and then that helps us figure our cost per unit. Right, so we used our cost sheets in order to figure out our cost per unit. In the process system, we take all three of these and then we have to allocate it to different departments. So here we're making tennis balls. And we're saying we'll allocate it to building the core of the tennis ball, the felt department, and the work in process department. And we're going to allocate all of these costs by a unit cost to make finished goods. Right? So what does that mean? It means that we can't trace each core to each tennis ball. We're making millions of tennis balls. How could we know the exact cost of one core. Like we buy a certain amount of rubber and then we're going to make an estimate. And then we're going to keep refining that estimate. So we might say we bought 100, each pound of rubber costs 10 cents. And we estimate that each unit of tennis ball takes 1/10 of a pound of rubber. Therefore, it's 1 cent per tennis ball. And then we'll adjust as prices change. And we're going to do that based on each department. So you can see the main difference here is instead of looking at individual job and being able to directly trace these pieces, we now have to make estimates for each of our buckets of direct material, direct labor, and factory overhead. And so the journal entries for this is just going to be an exchange across departments of work in process. So when we move one product to another product, we're going to just credit work in process for the department we're moving it from to the department we're moving it to. So this is, we're moving from the core to the felt. It's just changing the classification of the product. And when it gets to finished good, we just debit finished good inventory and credit the last department. So here's where we get interesting. So how do we make the allocations? We make the allocations by defining the equivalent unit of production. So this is a number of units that could have been started and completed during the period, given the costs incurred during the period. And so what we're trying to find here is based on the amount of cost and services occurred in the period, how many we're producing. And so let's pull this up real quick. We can use this as an example. Let's build this. So how are they calculating this? These estimates will be given, by the way. We can in practice, we learn how to calculate these in more advanced managerial classes. But I'm not asking you to do that in this class. You'll be given these percentages. So in this case, they're saying